Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Matthew Petrusik, Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute and the host of the Word on Fire show. Thank you for joining us. The enduring relevance of St. Thomas Aquinas. Most in contemporary secular culture have probably never heard of the name Thomas Aquinas, and if they have, they likely vaguely associate it with the medieval Dark Ages, which is one of the most flagrant misnomers for a historical period in the history of ideas. Well, it's true. St. Thomas Aquinas did indeed write close to 800 years ago and in Latin. However, his thought remains more pertinent than ever, not only to theology and philosophy, but also to current conversations on how to build a more stable, a more just, and a more prosperous political order. Today, to discuss the evergreen genius of one of Catholicism's greatest saints and doctors of the Church, and how his legacy continues in the life and work of the contemporary Dominican theologian Father Paul Murray, is Bishop Robert Barron. Well, Bishop, welcome back to the studio. Before we get into today's topic, you recently made a big trip to Rome for two reasons. So what were you doing there?
Yeah, I was invited by the Pontifical Academy for the Social Sciences to give a paper at a conference they were sponsoring. And it was for about 30 scholars. It wasn't open to the general public. It was just scholars kind of talking to each other. But around this theme of Aquinas's metaphysics in relation to Catholic social doctrine. So the head of the Academy, Cardinal Turkson, invited me to come give the talk. I was also there because my friend Paul Murray, who's a great friend of Word on Fire, we published books of his and his poetry, and I've known him for a long time, was officially retiring from the Angelicum. So they invited me to preside at Mass and to preach. So I went for those two reasons to Rome.
Well, today's show, as you know, is on the legacy of the Dominicans, of St. Thomas Aquinas, and your friend, Father Paul Murray, a good friend of Word on Fire as well.
Yeah.
But before we begin, for any new listeners or viewers we have, could you say a few words about the impact that St. Thomas Aquinas personally had on you and his thought on your development, becoming a priest and later a bishop?
Yeah, it was massive. Of course, I started off on the path toward the priesthood really because of Aquinas and his arguments for God's existence, which had a huge impact on me when I was a teenager. And then, it was a happy grace, I would say, as I was drawn into the Thomistic world, even as a young man. And that means a world of great balance, of great sanity. And it was a gift because I didn't know anything about philosophy. He was my entree into philosophy, and what a happy door to enter. You think of people who begin their philosophical career, let's say, by reading, Nietzsche or by reading Sartre or reading postmoderns. That's going to take you a very different place than reading Aquinas and Aristotle and his forebears. So that was a grace in my life, and from that time onward, now I'm an old man, and I am still very much beholden to the Thomistic world.
And one of the most remarkable parts of that story for me is that there was a time in Catholic education when young teens were expected to read St. Thomas Aquinas.
Well, and I'll say to the great credit of a teacher I had at Fenwick High School, though that was not typical of that time. I mean, as I've complained about banners and balloons, Catholicism, that's what you found mostly. And I do think it was a grace that I happened after, recess one day, all these sweaty boys are in the religion class, and this young friar taught us a little bit of Aquinas. And for me, it was like, an earthquake.
So let's turn now to looking at some of the major themes of the paper that you gave in Rome on St. Thomas Aquinas' conception of God and how that relates to his conception of the social and political good. Before we get into some of those specific arguments, however, what would you respond to someone who hears the word St. Thomas Aquinas, hears medieval philosophy, and they say something like, Bishop, our world is in social turmoil right now, dominated by conflict. We've totally lost all sort of common moral ground. Why in the world would we spend time thinking about a medieval philosopher who lived 800 years ago and wrote in Latin?
Yeah, because we're not imprisoned by someone's sociological setting or skin color or educational background. If someone's speaking truth, they're speaking truth. Can someone speak to us still from the 13th century? Well, why not? If human nature remains basically the same and a great genius is analyzing it, it's like saying, why read Shakespeare? Because haven't we moved on from Shakespeare? Well, quite frankly, no, we haven't, because Shakespeare saw things that were so deep and permanent in the human condition. Same with Aquinas. That's why it used to annoy me when the new atheists would say things like, the Bible, Bronze Age mythology. Well, I mean, why are we judging the truth of a text from its age? Then we wouldn't read anybody before the scientific period. Might there be certain truths about God, about nature, the world, society, and humanity that are simply perennial? And when great geniuses like the prophet Isaiah and Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas and Shakespeare see those things, well, I mean, we can't unsee them. We shouldn't unsee them. So, no, I think that's just a silly objection. You hear it, though. You're right.
You hear it a lot, including in universities.
Oh, yeah, especially there, sadly.
Yeah. So what do you say to the general principle that the present has a greater claim on our attention, including our moral attention, precisely because it is the present?
Well, that's silly. No, I mean, that's a presentism. That's a prejudice. We have to engage the present world. That's the world that we're in. And so it's not up to us to decide, the time we're given. It's given to us. So sure, we engage it, but we engage it in light of these great geniuses who came before us.
So moving back into the content of your paper now, you write towards the beginning, and I'll quote here: "With Thomas Aquinas, metaphysics comes first and ethics follows." Metaphysics comes first and ethics follow. Before we move deeper into your argument, could you say a few words about what metaphysics means, what ethics means, and the kind of relationship you're seeking to establish between them up front?
Yeah, I'm meaning it here, what asks and seeks to answer the deepest questions about the nature of being, you might say, is metaphysics. The study of being qua being is a classical definition. So I can study you from a chemical standpoint, a biological standpoint, a sociological, psychological standpoint, or I could study you in the measure that you're a being. So what's true of you in the measure that you exist? That's what metaphysics is looking for. So it's the articulation of the most fundamental principles about the nature of the real. And the argument there is that anything we say about politics or about ethics or about anything is predicated finally upon your perception of what's really real or ultimately real. That's why metaphysics comes first.
Right. So at the heart of the paper's argument is the claim that St. Thomas Aquinas' conception of what is good, which includes the social and political good, is inextricably grounded in his very specific conception of God.
Yeah.
And you highlight that Aquinas makes a fundamental distinction between God being defined as being itself versus God being defined as the greatest of all beings.
Right.
Now, some may hear this, Bishop, and say, well, that just sounds like a distinction without a difference. But you want to say it means everything.
That upon which everything depends. And, the roots of it are not simply philosophical, they're biblical. What's your name? Moses asked God. The answer comes back, ego sum qui sum, if God spoke in Latin. I am who I am. Well, in a way, it's saying the kind of question you're asking me is inappropriate. Because in asking for my name, you're asking to specify what kind of being I am. So there are a lot of gods around, presumably, in Moses' time, gods of this place and that, a god of the mountain, god of the river, the Egyptian gods, and so on. So which one are you? So he's looking for a category into which to place God. And by saying, I am who I am, God is obviating that question. He's saying that question is inappropriate because God is transcendent to any particular expression of being. He's not in any category. So you and I were human beings. So that's a category we're in. And then we can categorize ourselves in all kinds of other ways. We're men, we're of a particular race, we're a particular education. We can categorize ourselves. God can't be categorized. And you say, well, wouldn't he fit in the category being? And the famous answer Aquinas gives is no. God is not in the genus of being. And you say, well, what does that mean? It means he's not one thing among many. So all these beings I can see all around me. I can look up into space and see the galaxies and planets, and I can think about the angels. They're all beings. And wouldn't God be the highest of those beings? And the answer is no. He's not the highest being because that means he's delimited. That means he can be defined over and against other things. And that means by his very nature, he's definable. That means he has a finis or an end or a limit. That can't be true of God. So Thomas prefers the term ipsum esse subsistens. Esse meaning to be, it's an infinitive. Ipsum is like itself, and subsistens is subsisting through its own power. So God is the sheer act of to be itself. Now, in and through which all categorical beings exist. That's why we speak of God as the creator. He's the continual creator of the world. But he himself is not a being inside the universe. A mistake, I would say, made by every atheist, old and new, is, well, God must be a being somewhere in the universe. I don't see evidence of it, so that's a lot of nonsense. Well, no, you're asking, as Moses was, the wrong question. The creator of the universe is not an item in the universe. To me, the best comparison is author and book. So the author is utterly responsible for every little thing in the book, every character, every plot, every subplot, every comma, every period, everything. The author is responsible. But where's the author in the book? So here's all the characters, all the action. Where's the author? Well, he's not a character in the novel. He's the ground of the novel. That's a good comparison, I think, to God's relation to the world.
How does this conception of God help us understand, to unpack a little more, God identifying himself as I am to Moses? The use of I, the category of I, how can a God so defined be an I?
Well, no, God's an I, meaning he has intellect and will and freedom. I mean, so God is a person, and God has a personality, but we can't circumscribe him as a particular existent. He's the I in the fullest possible sense. He's freedom in the fullest possible sense. He's intelligence in the fullest possible sense. So God's capacity to know is utterly actualized, etc. So sure, but it's not, his existence is not poured into any receptacle. So think of this as the famous essence existence distinction in Aquinas. So like this thing is the act of being, Thomas says the actus essendi, poured, as it were, into a receptacle, meaning the nature of this thing, so that it's defined as a type of being. God is not received that way. God's not delimited that way. So my friend David Burrell of happy memory, David was a philosopher at Notre Dame, died just a few months ago. He used to say, to be God is to be. To be anything else is to be this or that. To be the planet Saturn, to be this galaxy, to be this picture. But to be God is to be.
Let's move a little deeper into the implications of this view of God in relationship to creation.
Yeah.
So you describe Aquinas as understanding God as both transcendent to, but also immanent within.
Right.
Now, on the surface, those could sound like mutually exclusive categories. Right. It has to be one or the other, but you say no, both.
No, it has to be. And that's, again, it's a hinge upon which a lot of things turn. So where's God in this room? Well, you say, well, nowhere, because this room is just made up of beings, right? There's cameras and lights and you and me and the table, and this room is just full of beings. God isn't one of the beings in the world. God isn't here. He's transcendent to this world, we say, not of this world. Now, at the same time, and by the same token, where's God in this world? Some listening to me are old enough to remember the Baltimore Catechism. It asks the question, where's God? Answer, everywhere. Well, that's also right, because ipsum esse is the ground of the to be of all things. And so Aquinas will say, God is in all things by essence, presence, and power. And then he adds a little word, intime, intimately so, right? God is in all things. Yes, I wouldn't exist were God not here and now sustaining me. But I'm not God. Nothing in this world is God, and God is in and through all things. That's, if you want, if I use a technical term of a panentheism, rightly defined, meaning all things in God, not as bits and pieces of God. Don't think of it that way. That's pantheism. But all things existing through the causal agency of God from moment to moment. Yeah, that's Catholic doctrine.
You also draw on the concept of contingency, understanding God in relationship to creation using the category of contingency. Say a little bit more about why that's so important.
Yeah, that's another hinge idea. To be contingent, it means you touch upon something, what it means literally. but it means you exist through causal influence of something else. And that's the starting point of some of the most important of the arguments for God's existence. You and I are contingent, meaning right now, our being here depends upon so many causal factors. The fact that the temperature of the room is at a certain level, if it was 1,000 degrees, we'd be incinerated. If it was 1,000 below zero, we'd be frozen. The oxygen in the room right now that we're breathing allows us to be. All the instruments around us, are allowing this state of affairs to obtain, right? So this state of affairs, you and I sitting here talking, is radically contingent. Which then, of course, causes you to say, well, all right, how about those things I just named? Are they contingent? Well, yeah, sure they are. And we can go through that process. What can't you do? You can't simply appeal endlessly to contingent things to explain a contingent state of affairs. You have to get finally to something which is non-contingent in its being. And that's what all people call God, Aquinas says. So God is the non-contingent source of contingent existence.
So following the arc of the paper, let's move now from metaphysics, the implications of metaphysics now for ethics. So the foundational ethical point you draw from this vision of God is that for St. Thomas Aquinas, God cannot, by definition, compete with anything in creation. Right. In fact, let me quote you here. You say, he can only will the good of the other, he being God, since what is other to him can be of no possible advantage to him. Right. Unpack that a little for us.
That's a very important point. God needs nothing, right? Because God's ipsum esse. God is sheerly actual in his form of existence. The world that he makes, therefore, is not in any way to his advantage. It can't be. How could God benefit from that which he's created in its entirety from nothing? He can't. He can't benefit from it, which means whatever he's directing toward it is for its good, not his own. Now we're in a very deep place, because to love is to will the good of the other, Aquinas says. Well, see, that's all God can do vis-a-vis the world. He can't operate in a self-interested way. He can't will something for his advantage. Whatever he wills, mind you, including the very being of the world, the fact that you and I are here, has to be an expression of love. It can't be anything else. So God is willing the good of the other. Now, that means he's allowing a space for the created realm. He's not there to dominate it. He's not there to lord over it and derive some benefit. Think now of all the classical myths and everything, where the gods are always in a kind of needy relationship to the world. And unless you give me what I want, I'm going to, Or stay with the mythology too, where when the gods do enter the world, they do so in a interruptive way, in a violent way. Like if I'm going to move into your chair right now, you got to get out of that chair. If you don't want to, then we're going to fight over it, right? Because there's a natural competitiveness between finite things. If the planet Saturn wants to move toward Earth, well, then things got to get out of its way, right? But God can come close to the world without clearing space or forcing things to give way. God can enter non-competitively, non-violently into his world.
And this is where you draw on the sort of the paradigm of the burning bush, right?
Right.
The next.
I think it's the best Old Testament image for it. The best new one is the incarnation itself, but the best Old Testament is the burning bush, that God comes close, the bush is on fire, radiant, and not consumed. That's the key thing there. If God came in and set the bush on fire, burned it up, all right, there's a typical invasive, competitive God. But the true God sets the bush on fire, and the bush becomes more beautiful and more radiant, and it's not consumed. As I say, the best New Testament example is the incarnation. We say two natures, divine and human, come together, and this is the Council of Chalcedon, very importantly, without mixing, mingling, or confusion. That means God doesn't have to dehumanize Jesus, doesn't have to knock something out of his humanity. That's why the church fought against all forms of, Christology that would say something of the human has to give way, right? So the human mind goes away and the divine mind takes over. The human will is kicked out. No, the church says Christ has two minds and two wills, right? Divine and human. It's because God is non-competitive to the world.
So our listeners and viewers may be captivated as I am by this vision, this cosmological vision and God in relation to creation. But then the question is, well, how does any of this relate to any, what we could say, practical or human concerns? It sounds so abstract. So let's turn to looking at that as the paper does. So as you just noted, you make the claim that God clears out a space for human existence and human action. How can that be the case if, in fact, God does inhabit everything?
Well, yeah, he does, but he's also transcendent to it. So he's not of it, competing with it. He can let it be. See, and that's why, like in the Bible, I think I use the example of the David literature in 1 and 2 Samuel. In some of the earlier biblical texts, God does seem to appear in a more kind of mythological way, like he's just a being, like a human being appearing. By the time you get to the Samuel literature, everything is unfolding according to psychological or political laws. It makes perfect sense on those terms. And all that time, God is active. God is accomplishing his will. And so the space is cleared for David and to make his own political decisions and for his family relationships to unfold, for the psychology of the various characters to express themselves. And in and through all of it, non-competitively, is the presence of God. God achieving what he wants to achieve. That's a very subtle biblical vision. Within this space, how do we define the authentic human good and the authentic social good? Well, ultimately, it's a surrender to God. I mean, so if God is the supreme good at the top of the hierarchy of goods, but then these values that reflect God can be discerned within the world. There I'm with Dietrich von Hildebrand. I think you see certain values. At the summit of that hierarchy is God, the summum bonum. So a life that's lived ordered to God and under the aegis of these limited goods that reflect God, that's where we talk about the virtues and so on and so forth. That's the good life. The good is discernible. And the path of virtue can be taught to kids. Like, here's a way to achieve the good. The same way, see, I'm an Aristotelian here, the same way you learned a sport. So you want to play that like that? Yeah, I'd love to play like, and pick your sports hero. Okay, I got the path. Here's the path. You got to do X, Y, and Z. You got to practice and become habituated. I think of good coaches I had that through drills were just teaching us the moves. Okay, you got to get these moves of basketball into your body, Same in the moral order. There I'm, Aristotelian. There are certain goods you want to attain. Okay, here are the habits that lead to the virtues that become part of your body, really. They become part of your whole makeup. And now, walk that path. On a comparative note, we can look at two contemporary political ideologies, let's say classical liberalism and postmodern political philosophy, just in a generic sense. Now, those are two bitter ideological enemies, but they would both agree that the only way to do politics is to clear the field of all metaphysical speculation. And you and Aquinas say... Yeah, it's deadly. And... huge mistakes have followed from that, and a lot of sufferings follow from it. When you unmoor the political from an ethical and ultimately metaphysical source, trouble will ensue. When I was a kid, you heard all the time the slogan, don't legislate morality. Well, see, Aristotle would have he looked at you puzzled, like, what are you talking about? Every legislation is a legislation of morality. We better limit the speed of the cars can drive. Well, that's an ethical decision. I want to protect life. We better raise taxes. Well, yeah, because I think we need certain programs that will help people. It's an ethical decision. Stop imposing your view on me. Well, every law imposes a moral vision. That's the way it works, So de facto, we're never really unmoored from ethics and from a fundamental metaphysics. You can always kind of sniff it out. Your metaphysics might be, it's matter and energy, it's matter and motion. That's all there really is. So that's a metaphysical claim that you're making. From that will follow certain ethical convictions, from which follow legal application and so on. But I'd rather be upfront about it. Let's have a good metaphysical argument, and ground our ethics accordingly.
We'll turn to the thought of and the legacy of Father Paul Murray in a moment.
Yeah,
but
okay.
Just to finish that point, one of the common critiques of, say, a Thomistic vision of reality as it relates to politics is that it's going to end up as a theocracy or a totalitarianism, precisely because it is totalizing. The vision is totalizing.
Yeah.
So how do we respond to that critique?
Well, yeah, it's a theocracy only in a very broad sense of the term, meaning that it's a politics lived under the aegis of God as the summum bonum. But that's very different from, let's establish a king, who is going to reign through divine right and so on. What I'm talking about is perfectly compatible with, let's say, a democratic or a Republican sort of construal of the political reality. I mean, that's fine. Theocratic only in that very broad sense we should be. But it's utterly compatible with, let's say, a more liberal democratic view.
So during your visit to Rome, you also had the opportunity to honor your great friend and friend of Word on Fire, Father Paul Murray, who, like St. Thomas Aquinas, is a Dominican.
Yeah.
Before we turn to two specific themes that you highlighted in his life and his work, could you say just a few words about what is the Dominican charism, and how does both Father Paul Murray and St. Thomas Aquinas sort of represent that?
Yeah, the motto is Veritas, isn't it? It's truth, and I was thinking of the black and white habit of the Dominicans. And they were called the Black Friars in the Middle Ages because they wore this beautiful black cape. I saw those at the celebration. They usually don't wear the cape, but on very high occasions they do. So you have the stark white habit with the black cape. And there's something bracing about, the black and the white. And Dominicans stand for truth and for these distinctions. Think of Aquinas, is famous in his method for distinctions. When you're resolving a question, well, we must distinguish A from B. My intellectual hero, Robert Sokolowski, used to say, philosophy is simply the art of making distinctions. It's a very fine definition. And I thought about it a lot over the years. Bad philosophy comes from making bad distinctions or failing to make the right distinctions. So that's part of the Dominican thing, I think, is the black and the white and the devotion to truth, but also, proclaiming the gospel in the world. They're the order of preachers. And they went out, you might say, from the monasteries. They were out in the streets in the Middle Ages. That's where the young Aquinas would have seen them, in the streets of Naples, most likely, preaching. And he was attracted to them.
In your beautiful tribute to Father Murray, you identified two characteristics that you think really he exemplified, but also, again, exemplifying the Dominican tradition. One was the primacy of grace, and the other was joy. So to sort of draw this to a conclusion, how do those represent both Father Paul Murray and the Dominican tradition?
That theme of the primacy of grace, I think in the homily, go back even to the De Auxiliis controversy, late 16th century, within Catholicism, between the Jesuits and Dominicans. And make a long story short, the Jesuits putting a greater stress on human, freedom and accomplishment, and the Dominicans consistently putting a stress on the primacy of grace, that grace comes first. I think I mentioned in the sermon that Paul Murray was always worried about what he called willful spiritualities. So he's a master of the spiritual life, right? That's what he studied. And a spirituality that makes the spiritual life our project, and even the great figures, John of the Cross and Teresa, with their metaphors of, climbing the mountain and finding interior castles and all that. And Paul, I think, is fine with that. But he worries at times that it might lead in the direction of a certain willfulness, where what matters is always God coming first, God acting first. I used to say, if the Reformation could have been avoided if instead of gratia sola, Luther just said gratia prima. Grace comes first. Okay, yes. And we're always in danger of forgetting that. And Luther might have been right in reminding us of that. When it devolves into gratia sola, then we've got problems because now we're getting more competitive, right? Where I would say, no, grace comes first, and then burning bush. It makes our lives more beautiful and more radiant. It lifts up our minds and our wills. But grace comes first.
And joy?
Yeah, well, to me, Paul Murray is the embodiment of that. I've spent so many wonderful evenings and lunches and dinners with him over the years, and you laugh a lot when you're with Paul Murray, and he just radiates joy. And I agree with that claim that, the flag of the Holy Spirit is joy. If you want to see, is the Holy Spirit alive in that person? There are a lot of indicators, but the best indicator is joy. Yeah. And he has always been to me someone who seems possessed by the Holy Spirit.
Well, it's now time for our listener question. Today we have a question about the devil and free will from Richard, who's calling in from Melbourne, Australia.
Yeah, okay.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name's Richard, and I'm from Melbourne, Australia. My question is about the devil. I can understand how we humans rebel against God, because even the best of us don't know God fully and completely. But if the devil is a purely spiritual being, he presumably knows God and has a full understanding of God's nature and omnipotence. So doesn't he know that his rebellion is ultimately futile? Thank you, and God bless.
Yeah, it's a good question because it gets to some deeper issues. Because I don't think it's entirely a matter of reason. So, yes, that's a key part of it. Do I know the good? But the Socratic fallacy is that knowing the good means I will automatically do it. Can we talk about a corruption or a limitation at other levels of the devil's being? Having said that, too, remember the devil's mind is not infinite. So even there, a high angel, Aquinas affirms that, even a high angel would not know fully the very essence and nature of God. So there's room there even for a certain, misunderstanding. But it's a good sort of metaphysical test case. But I wouldn't succumb to the Socratic fallacy when talking about the devil.
Well, thank you, Richard, very much for your question. If you would like to ask Bishop Barron a question for a future Word on Fire show episode, please visit askbishopbarron.com. That's askbishopbarron.com, and we'd love to hear from you. That's all the time we have for today, Bishop. Thanks so much for coming in again, and we'll talk again soon.
Always good being with you, Matt. Thanks.
That does it for us today. Thanks for joining us on the Word on Fire show. If you are interested in learning more about how Word on Fire can help you grow closer to Christ, become a better evangelist with and for others, and work for the common good, consider joining the Word on Fire Institute. Check us out at institute.wordonfire.org. That's institute.wordonfire.org. See you next time.